Hi everyone, Dr. Hall with you. We're going to talk about regulation of sexual behavior here in lecture 12, which is a little different than the biology focus of most of the course, but it's really important, so we're going to talk about it. So first of all, we have to acknowledge that there is a decision that is made most of the time, as long as it's consensual activity, to be sexually active, right? So most people at some point in time in their lives, unless they've taken a vow of celibacy, which is very few people, will be sexually active. And so the question becomes when and in what situations, with whom, and what types of behaviors they'll choose to engage in. And there's lots of different things that you can do, right? So you can have sex with yourself, masturbation, you can kiss people, right? And if it's open mouth or with tongue, that's called French kissing. You can touch other people's bodies in sensual and intimate and hopefully pleasurable ways. And right, remember, touching somebody else's genitals is called mutual masturbation. It's such a strange term. Oral sex, so putting your mouth on somebody else's body. So if it's oral vulvar contact, that's cunnilingus. If it's oral penile, that's fellatio or a blowjob. Or oral anal contact is called analingus. Genital to genital contact without actual penetration is called outer course sometimes. And then, of course, intercourse is where there's actual penetration. So it can be vaginal sex or anal sex. And then there are all types of other things that people can and do engage in, depending on their particular interests. So we're going to talk first about the external influences and specifically about formal regulation of sexual behavior. So we actually have quite a bit of formal regulation of sexual behavior. So there are a lot of religious rules about when it is okay to have sex, right? So a lot of major religions say that you can't have sex until you're married. Many of them say that masturbation is a sin or is forbidden. Many of them also forbid homosexuality, citing a certain passage in the Bible that's found in the same section of the Bible that says that you can't wear clothing made with fibers from more than one type. So if you're wearing a cotton polyester shirt, you would be violating that. Adultery, right? So cheating on your spouse. And even contraception is often felt to be sinful by several organized religions, including Catholicism. So there are a lot of religious rules about sexual behavior, and then there are also a lot of legal rules, actually. So divorce is a legal process. So you might say, well, does that have to do with sex? Well, it has to do with marriage and that kind of making that commitment that you're only going to have that sexual partner, which may or may not be the case if you have an open marriage, right? Recognition or non-recognition of same-sex marriage, right? So we just had a couple of Supreme Court justices say that they would be open to overturning the Obergefell decision that legalized same-sex marriage in this country. We also have things known as age of consent. So statutory rape is having sex with someone who is considered too young to give consent. And in different states, it's at different ages. So in Wisconsin, I think it's 17 or under. So if an 18-year-old has sex with a 17-year-old, technically they could be convicted of a crime of rape, statutory rape. We also certainly have laws against sexual assault and rape, so forcibly having sex with someone. And then there's all kinds of laws against sodomy. And so in many states, still having anal sex is technically illegal. So in many states, there's a law against it. Bestiality, so having sex with animals, is outlawed in many places. Polygamy, having more than one wife, for example. And prostitution. So interestingly, prostitution is illegal in most of the United States, but not everywhere. Oh, and you can't see that. Let me see. Can I turn this off? Here we go. So there's an image of Mustang Ranch, And Mustang Ranch is one of several legal brothels that's operated in the state of Nevada. You might think it's in Las Vegas, but it's not. Actually, prostitution is technically illegal in the city of Las Vegas. But there are other municipalities in Nevada where it is legal. And the women who work at the Mustang Ranch, interestingly, have worked with some reproductive health scholars and helped us learn a lot about the best practices for using condoms and how effective they are. So that's been really interesting. Then there's also sex toys and pornographic materials are considered illegal in many places. And so you'll oftentimes see such stores branded as novelty stores, or these are gag gifts. They're not actually for use for sex, which is how they kind of try to skirt around the fact that technically what they're selling is illegal. All right. Oh, yes, this is a really great book. So Alexa Albert was a reproductive health scholar, and she spent a year with the women at Mustang Ranch and wrote a book about them called Brothel. So our country has a lot of rules and regulations about sexual behavior, but in other countries it can be even more significant or even more stringent. So what we're seeing here are some images of women in the country of Jordan, where honor killing is actually condoned in that country. So what that means is if a woman has sex outside of marriage, her family is honor bound to kill her, right? And so the image that we see on the right is actually some women that are being held at a jail in order to protect them from their families. These were women who were raped, so they actually had non-consensual sex. They weren't married, and their families, often their brothers or their fathers, feel like it is their duty to kill them. And so they're being kept for their safety in a jail. Right? So really, I don't know how to describe that. Similarly, the same type of thing, there was a Norwegian woman in Dubai. She was there on holiday and she was raped. And so she went to the police and said, I was raped, and they put her in jail because she had sex outside of marriage, right? They don't distinguish whether it's consensual or not. And it actually took a couple of months for the Norwegian government to be able to get her released. So these ideas about female purity and virtue and whose responsibility that is are quite powerful and disturbing. Russia, kind of in the lead up to when they held the Sochi Olympics, actually, Putin passed a whole bunch of anti-gay propaganda laws. So that was really interesting. And they forbid any positive or even neutral, actually, portrayals of anything LGBT. Also forbids adoption. So if you're gay or lesbian, you can't adopt. And in some cases, even allowed for children to be removed from their parents' homes if their parents were gay. And this has been really problematic, as you can imagine. And there are all these anti-pedophilia groups that sprung up and started luring young gay men and kind of trapping them and then beating them up, and in some cases even murdering them and posting it on the internet. And the police aren't prosecuting because they do not value the lives of people who are LGBT, right? So those things are allowed to continue. In this country, we have hate crime legislation, so you cannot beat up somebody just for being gay and get away with it, or at least you should not. But it's different in different places. And of course, it can change, right? These are things that can change over time. And so, interestingly, you might remember when we talked about sexual orientation way back in lecture 3, that in some countries it's against the law to be gay and you can be put to death, right? So Iran and Saudi Arabia and a few other countries, you can be put to death just for being gay. And so about a year ago, actually, no, this was in 2017, the United Nations wanted to put a statement out and say, this is not okay. Like, you cannot have the death penalty just because somebody is gay. That's not okay to execute someone just because they're LGBT. And the United States was one of only 12 other countries to not support this ban, right? So our own government said, yeah, it's okay if you execute people for being gay in your country, which is troubling to me. So all of these things are what we would call kind of formal regulation of sexual behavior. And there's a great chapter in the book about this. And this is a graphic that you'll find there that I have added to. So what we can see kind of in the middle circle, in the gray circle, are the types of sexual behavior that historically, across many different cultures and societies, have been the types of behaviors that have been encouraged. So what we can see in that inner circle is heterosexual, right? So men and women having sexual relationships with each other. Monogamous, right? Meaning you only have one sexual partner, you don't have multiple partners. Marital, meaning within the confines of a legalized union or religiously sanctioned marriage. And procreative, meaning that you're not taking steps to try to not have a baby. Whereas all the other things are things that oftentimes are dissuaded or formally legislated against, or there are specific rules against. So as we can see, as opposed to heterosexual, right, any type of homosexual, bisexual, or asexual behavior is usually frowned upon. Certainly incest is frowned upon. Non-monogamy is often frowned upon, as are extramarital and premarital sex. Extramarital would be cheating, and premarital would be having sex before you're married. And then any type of non-procreative activity, there are often rules against that, right? So masturbation, contraception, and even homosexuality, you could say, is actually a form of non-procreative sex. Non-consensual is often illegal, but not everywhere, especially if it's with your spouse. So there are many places in the world where raping your spouse is legal. And then, of course, rape and bestiality. So would fall under that subheading, right? An animal cannot give consent. So we find a lot of these same patterns in a lot of different cultures and societies over space and over time. So anytime you find something that kind of crops up again and again and again in lots of different societies, you have to say to yourself, what are the potential advantages of these rules to this society, right? Why does this keep coming up? So maybe pause, like take a moment and say, okay, historically throughout human history, what are the reasons why some of these might have been beneficial to the society, the culture, or the power structures that existed? And so the answers are, one, for most of human history, we had trouble keeping our populations up. There were famines, there were plagues, there were competing tribes, there was a ton of work to do on the farm. So throughout most of human history, until about the past century, the problem was there weren't enough of us, not that there were too many of us. So throughout much of human history, the pressure has been to go forth and multiply, to reproduce, right? So we didn't want people to not have kids. We needed them to have kids so that some of them would survive to carry on our community, our town, to do the work, to fight and become soldiers. So we, until fairly recently in human history, we wanted to have a lot of babies. The other thing, so that's where the procreative and the heterosexual come in. The other thing is that until about 150 years ago, we didn't have any antibiotics, and we actually didn't have any treatments for things like syphilis or chlamydia or gonorrhea. So it was advantageous to the public health if you didn't have a lot of sexual partners, right? If everybody never had sex with anybody else till they got married, and then they only had sex with each other, then there would be no STDs at all, right? It would be virtually impossible because they can only be spread from person to person through sexual activity. So if you never had sex and your spouse never had sex until you got together, perfect. It's a brilliant public health intervention. Now, however, we have condoms, we have antibiotics, we have lots of other ways to deal with many of the sexually transmitted infections. So this stigma, this prohibition against non-monogamy might not be quite so important. In terms of the marital sex, right? So think about why that's so important, as well as monogamy. So there's two things that can do for you. One is that throughout much of human history, many of our cultures have been patriarchal, where property and inheritance and all those things get passed down through the male line. So it was really important to know who the father was. So you wanted to make sure that the woman wasn't having sex with anybody else besides her husband, right? So that was really important. The other piece about marital sex is that then if you do have children, there is this structural foundation of a family within which to raise them. And different cultures do that differently, but many of them do that, particularly ours, within the nuclear family. And as a parent, I can tell you it's definitely easier if there are two of you. But you know, there's lots of ways to successfully raise children in environments that are full of love and adult supervision and support. So, although there are all these reasons, right? Let me just get my head out of here. Right? So this kind of stabilization of the social order through marriage, ability to track paternity, the public health benefits of STI prevention, being able to make sure that someone is taking responsibility for raising the children, continuing your community and having lots of babies, right? All of these things are benefits that came out of some of these rules. And that's probably why we see many of these rules in many different places, many different times. But the important thing is that as situations change, as we have a population problem on this planet, there's more of us than the planet can sustain, especially if we're consuming resources like Americans. And given that we have other ways to prevent sexually transmitted infections, we have other ways to track paternity if we really needed to, but we don't really need to quite so much anymore, right? The question becomes, are these rules still benefiting us, right? And so we get to decide, right? We create the society we want to live in over time by participating in it, by contributing to the lawmaking and rulemaking processes and how they are interpreted, right? So whenever you see these taboos or social rules, there's usually some benefit that it was providing to the culture or to at least the ruling class, right? But that doesn't mean that those benefits outweigh the harms that causes, or that it should be continued based on that kind of risk and benefit calculation, right? So when we look at the death penalty for being gay, for example, that doesn't make sense. Right? Okay, so for external regulatory factors, these are the formal ones. So these are when we think about official laws and official religious rules. The next part of the lecture is going to be talking about informal, but still external sources of regulation of sexual behavior.